All right, hello and welcome to a talk about asymptotic scaling. This is going to be fairly different from my other videos. My other videos are mostly hey, here's a thing that is about to ship, or I'm currently working on, and or has recently shipped, and here's the goals, here's how we got here. Talking about like doing a little behind the scenes and a little bit of analysis of like how we got to the thing that we're shipping, or that we already shipped. This is very different because this is a design talk that I gave, I think in 2021 or 22. I don't remember when exactly I gave this design talk, to all of Riot Design about a specific type of mathematical scaling in games that's quite common, that is fairly poorly understood. If you're wondering why I'm making this video, is why I'm redoing this presentation, it's not just because I wanted to redo the presentation. In fact, really all I had from the original presentation is my slides. I don't know, I don't remember if I made any notes for the presentation, so I'm kind of just like just making things up as I go along, looking at the slides and saying like, what do I think I would have said years ago when I made this presentation? But the reason why I'm doing this again is I've mentioned this presentation a few times on stream. Some people seem to have some interest in it, and so I put up a poll in my Discord of like, what do people want the next video to be on? And asymptotic scaling actually, to my surprise, won. I'm kind of surprised people want to hear about a uh, math presentation, especially because, as I've mentioned on stream, when I talk about this presentation, got a lot of feedback on this presentation after I gave it to Riot Design that it was really useful and it was helpful to help understand the concept, but it was really dry, and some people said it was kind of hard to listen to. So if you're not interested in mathematics, or you're afraid that this might be a little too dry for you, feel free to not watch this video because this might not be the video for you. If you are interested in math, though, if you're interested and want to hear about that and hear about game design, then this might be a good talk for you. So, a couple of disclaimers before I get into it. Asymptotic scaling, if you look up this terminology, you're not really going to find much because this is not a very studied topic. This is something where I actually went to one of my college professors and asked him what I should call it, because this concept doesn't really come up much in fields that have lots of mathematical research done in them, right? Like physics, biology, etc. It's really most common in games, and while there are actually many math papers and a lot of research that's been done on math in games, this topic in particular doesn't it hasn't really been researched or studied much. It's not that complex, right? So it's not like you would do a PhD research topic on this or anything like that. And so uh, this is what my math professor, Sandy, shout out, thank you, Sandy, recommended that I call it. But really, I'm sure that other people call it, different things when they're talking about it elsewhere. Really, this is just a description of any kind of scaling that's approaching an asymptote. So we'll get into exactly what that's all about later on. But specifically, this is talking about a review of percent of reductive systems. So like I said, this is the exact same slides that I used to present this topic to Riot Design back in the day, and years ago. So this was my presentation of like, okay, who am I as a the game designer that works at Riot Games? So I'll use this as an opportunity to kind of explain like, why am I talking about math? Well, if you don't know, I actually have a bachelor's degree in mathematics. I also I double majored in math and computer science, but uh, math is an interesting topic in games because there's a lot of math involved in game design, actually. Any game with movement, for example, uses a lot of vector math, usually, to do movement, which is very complicated. And I would recommend studying up on your vector math if you ever want to make your own game with any kind of meaningful movement, because it's probably going to come up a lot. In fact, I would say probably like, I don't know, once every 2 weeks or so, someone asks me to come help them do some vector math while I like working on something in for League, because I do vector math and I'm not too bad at it, I guess. But there's a lot of different types of mathematics that come up a lot in games. Another one I would recommend, highly recommend, if you ever get the opportunity to take a class on linear algebra, I would highly recommend it. I think linear algebra is one of the most useful fields of math, and I actually think that my personal opinion is that I think it should actually be focused on and taught at lower levels of education, because it's just an incredibly useful form of mathematics for um, a lot of different fields, not just games. But games definitely take advantage of it. But there's lots of different types of math that are used in games. But I particularly want to focus on this one because asymptotic scaling and percent reductive systems are fairly common in games, especially like MOBAs, ARPGs, roguelikes. They're fairly common, but they're not very well understood even by game designers, and they're really poorly understood by players. And so this is one of the, like, how why I wanted to do this talk was give some information and like help people understand these systems better. So that's what this is all about. This slide was mostly at the time I made this presentation, I was working on Wild Rift, but I was coming from the context of like I'd worked on League for about 4 years prior to moving to Wild Rift. At this point, of course, I've worked on League for over 6 years because I came back to League and I've been working on it for a while again. But we can just kind of move past this because this is just explaining some of the things that I've worked on. This slide was to explain some of the games that I was playing at the time or had played recently at the time that take advantage, like that have lots of examples of percent reductive systems, right? These are generally speaking, like MOBAs like League or Wild Rift, or ARPGs like, Risk of Rain, or, loot-based ARPGs like Path of Exile or Last Epoch down here, roguelikes like Slay the Spire, or Nova Drift. These are the types of games that tend to feature asymptotic scaling. There are lots of other games that do as well. Souls-like games do tend to have them too, etc. Right? Lots of different games, like RPGs in general, tend to have like any kind of any kind of RPG systems often involve asymptotic scaling in them. Not always, but that often is present if you have like damage reduction, for example. Here are some examples, right? Because I'm sure a lot of people are like, what the hell are you talking about? What is a percent reductive system? So this is like damage reduction, tenacity, cooldown reduction, mana cost reduction, right? Resistances in ARPGs, cost reductions, duration reduction, damage avoidance. In roguelikes, you talk about like shop cost, mana cost, energy cost, animation time reduction, right? This is like cast time reduction, right? I remember back in Ragnarok Online, for example, this is going real far back. In the original versions of Ragnarok Online, their way that their formula was set up for cast time reduction, you'd actually get your cast times to 0, so you could actually reach the asymptote. We'll talk about that in a second. But lots of different ways you can think about percent reductive systems or see examples of them in games. I have some examples here. Again, funny, this is Legend Tenacity. When I made this presentation, Legend Tenacity was still in the game. But Legend Tenacity, right? Meditate, which has percent damage reduction. Warwick's E, which has percent damage reduction. The membership card from Slay the Spire, which is shop cost reduction. Tougher Times from Risk of Rain 2, which is percent chance to avoid damage. And then Resistances from Path of Exile in the back here. And then CDR on Intelligence at the bottom here, right? There's lots of examples of these systems in games, right? You will not, if you go looking for these in most games that are in these genres, you will find lots of examples. Like don't think that this is something that's not going to come up super frequently if you're really looking for it, because these systems are quite common. Let's start out with the math here. We can model these systems as a pretty simple multiplicative system, right? The beginning here is actually very straightforward, right? Where y is our final value, right? If we're using damage reduction as an example, y is the final damage that you actually take. A is the percentage damage reduction, right? So if you have 50% damage reduction, let's say it's 0.5, right? And then X is the amount of damage coming in, right? So if you're about to take 100 damage, X is 100, and you have 50% damage reduction, A is 0.5, Y, the amount of damage that you actually take, is 50, right? You multiply 100 by 0.5, you get 50, boom, you're done, right? That's pretty straightforward, right? It's pretty easy to understand this. Here's where it starts getting a little bit less intuitive, let's say. If you divide both sides by A, right, the damage reduction amount, we can start using X to calculate the effective value that we're getting out of this, right? So in the damage reduction case, this is effective HP, right? How much HP multiplier do you get because of your damage reduction, right? Because this is where things start getting unintuitive, right? If you ask someone, like some random person playing a game, how much more effective HP do you have when you have 20% damage reduction? A lot of people will say 20%. That is not correct. It's actually 25%, right? If you ask someone, how much more effective HP do you have if you have 50% damage reduction? Some people will say 100, right? Like some people will intuitively understand that you've doubled your HP, but a lot of people will say 50% more effective HP. So let's get some examples in order to showcase like why this form of scaling is really powerful. 25% damage reduction is 33% more effective HP, right? You can see the math here. 50% is 100% more effective HP, right? So 25% more damage reduction, right? Linearly adding, right? You've doubled your damage reduction, but you've effectively tripled the amount of effective bonus HP that you're getting, right? So you can see how powerful this scaling is. And then if you take another step up, you add another 25% damage reduction, you actually triple this effective HP value, right? Look at how powerful this scaling is. The more of it you get, the more powerful it is, right? That is why this is a particularly interesting and not intuitive form of scaling. People don't realize that like going from 0% to 10% damage reduction is not the same as going from 50 to 60% damage reduction. 50 to 60% is much more powerful, right? You can see that, that example here going from 25 to 50 and then 50 to 75. It gets more and more powerful as you get more of it. And the reason for that is that because mathematically speaking, you are approaching the zero value on the asymptote. Because in this case, we're calculating effective HP. If you had 100% damage reduction, your effective HP is infinite because you can't take damage, right? And so we're approaching an infinite value in a way that, in a very, very, very powerfully scaling way, right? There are multiple different ways you can approach zero like this. This is a very powerful one. And this is very standard, right? This is just how it normally works. You can see this scaling is very powerful. Here's another example of a graph. This one's like harder to read, but you can see like how crazy the scaling gets. One thing I did want to briefly mention, I do think this slide is kind of out of order. I probably should have put this later on, but we'll cover it now, is there are ways of subverting this, right? Some games actually do some clever mathematical tricks under the hood to sort of subvert this, right? This is an example of damage reduction. This tooltip here is from Last Epoch. I have no idea if they still do this. I haven't played Last Epoch in a few years. But the way that Last Epoch subverted this was by actually shifting the asymptotic scaling down away from the player, right? Basically making it so the player experiences something that's more intuitive in a way that's very subtle. So using Path of Exile and Last Epoch as an example, both of these games use percent damage reduction to different types, right? You have resistance to these, and both of them by default cap this at 75%. So in Path of Exile, for example, if you have 75% fire resistance or in PoE, and you lose 1% fire resistance, the player intuitively will think, I'm going to take a little bit more fire damage, like 1% more fire damage. That's not true. You're actually taking about 5% more fire damage. Because if you think of it as like, okay, if you have 100 incoming damage, if you have 75% resistance, you would take 25 damage. And if you have 74% resistance, you're going to take 26 damage, right? But if you look at that relative to the 25 damage, that's about 5% more damage, right? Of the 25 compared to the 26, right? In Last Epoch, though, that's actually not how it works, right? In Last Epoch, if you have 100 damage, because enemies get 1% resistance per area level up to 75%, and most of the content of the game is after area level 75, if you were to take that same 100 damage in Last Epoch, you would actually, at 75% resistance, take 100 damage, right? But if you lose 1% resistance, right, you have 74% physical resistance in Last Epoch, instead of taking 5% more damage, you actually take about 1% more damage because you take 101, point something damage. And so it's a much more intuitive system because, as you can see here, they've actually shifted the asymptote away from zero. So be careful about how you use these systems, right? Because you can see this plot is a little bit different. The Wolfram Alpha plot that I used here as a screenshotted here. There are ways of subverting asymptotic scaling. I'm not going to get more in depth on this after this, but there are ways of subverting this in some games such that you don't actually get this, the thing like that, exactly the thing that I'm going to be describing for most of the video here. So another form of asymptotic scaling is CDR, right? And linear scaling is a way of getting at this that's fairly different, right? Haste this is haste as an example, is not asymptotically scaling. Haste is not very well understood by players, I would say. Each point of haste is X% more spells. In fact, haste actually works pretty much identically to attack speed in League. But most players, if you ask them to look at this graph, or ask them to look at like how haste affects their cooldown reduction, especially people who have played since CDR was in the game, they will say things like haste has diminishing returns, or haste is bad to stack. Neither of those things is true, right? You can look at these examples. I just pulled some random examples here of I literally just searched like ability haste on the subreddit, I think, and just threw in some screenshots at the time of people will say things like has diminishing returns, or not linear, or whatever, right? It's like haste is literally linear, right? We introduced haste into League of Legends to avoid the asymptotic scaling on CDR, right? Well, that's one of the reasons. There were other reasons, but this difference between the way that haste scales and the way that CDR scales is not very well understood. And this is one of the reasons why I think a presentation like this, or like information like this, can be pretty valuable. So there's another point here where I want to make a distinction here and help people understand that there's a couple of very different ways you can set up these systems. You can have a multiplicative system and you can have an additive system. Where in an additive system, if you have 25% damage reduction, two instances of that, you get 50% reduction or 50% total damage reduction. In a multiplicative system, you don't add those together. You actually essentially multiply the damage multiple times by the damage reduction or the the reduction or whatever you're doing here, right? Like generalize this to any kind of percent reduction, right? What this means is that, like, say you have 100%, or say you have 100 damage incoming, you have two instances of 25% damage reduction. In an additive system, you add those two instances of damage reduction together and you say, okay, I have 50% reduction, I take 50 damage. In a multiplicative system, you multiply that 100 by the 25% damage reduction. So that's, first it'll be 75, right? Because you take 25% damage, less damage. And then you would multiply that by 25% less damage again, which is a different mathematical process, right? And so you end up with ultimately 43.75% total damage reduction, or total cost reduction, or cast time reduction, or mana cost reduction, or whatever, rather than 50%. Ultimately, the more dangerous version of this is the additive systems, right? The additive systems are where things get very scary. This is why CDR in the old League of Legends was so scary. And, the main reason why it had to be capped at 40% was because it was an additive system, right? You got 10 CDR plus 10 CDR meant you had 20% CDR. And each point got more and more and more valuable because CDR was an asymptotically scaling system, right? In a multiplicative system, like for example in League of Legends, damage reduction is multiplicative, right? If you have two sources of damage reduction, if you have two sources of 20% damage reduction, right? Say you're, I don't know, Warwick, and you have some other form of damage reduction. I don't know where that came from, but you press E on Warwick, and you have some other form of damage reduction, like, I don't know, the old Force of Nature, like the previous one that had magic damage reduction on it. Those would not add to give you, 95% damage reduction against magic damage, right? They would multiply and you'd end up with, I don't know, no, numerically it would depend on your E rank, I guess. But those would multiply and, be a little less powerful when combined. The multiplicative systems tend to be more complicated and a lot less intuitive, right? Players generally will expect additive systems because they look at the systems and they say, oh, I have 10% damage reduction here and I have 15% damage reduction here. I would expect to get 25% damage reduction. That's the intuitive thing to do, generally speaking. The multiplicative system, though, limits you. You can never hit the asymptote and without like severe rounding or getting 100% reduction in one shot, because the multiplicative systems, right? This is a little bit of calculus, right? But if you're familiar with limits in calculus, you'll know, hey, approaching the limit of something doesn't mean that any individual member of that set is ever going to, like, a member of that series is ever going to actually hit the value, right? So, like, the limit as you approach 2, none of those individual series values is ever at 2, right? It's the limit that gets to 2 or whatever, right? We don't need to talk about that. That's more complicated math topic for another day. This is where I started talking about, when I think it's ideal to use asymptotic systems over linear ones. Generally speaking, I'm of the opinion that this type of scaling is very, very dangerous and very, very unintuitive at very high values. And the danger in it is mostly when you give players a lot of choice and optionality in the system, right? You can see here at the bottom right where it's like, hey, if there's significant player choice in an asymptotic system, the optimal decision making is much more complex and is very unintuitive for players, right? As an example here, in League, prior to the change from CDR to haste, it was optimal. Once you bought any CDR, further CDR values actually got more gold efficient, right? Once you bought your Black Cleaver and got 20% CDR from your Black Cleaver, it was actually optimal. Like, your further CDR purchases were more efficient, right? They were worth more gold because you were getting more value per point of CDR than you were when you got went from 0 to 20. Going from 20 to 40 was more gold efficient, right? You were literally getting more value per point. And so that's very dangerous, and again, creates very unintuitive optimizations for players. Whereas when I think of things like Kassadin's passive that gives him damage, percent reduced magic damage, like, This system is this is theoretically an asymptotically scaling system, but number one, it's a very low value. So sure, does it give Kassadin 11% more effective HP, so it's slightly more powerful than it looks to the player? Yes. However, there's not really a lot of other ways. There's actually currently in the game no other ways for Kassadin to get percent, magic damage reduction. So he can't actually scale this in a asymptotically scaling way. He doesn't have any choice in this system. He's just getting magic damage reduction. And so it's a really effective way to allow the player to intuit, oh, I just take less magic damage. Okay, cool. 10% less magic damage? Great. I understand I'm supposed to pick Kassadin into magic damage. Awesome. That's very intuitive, right? And there are some systems where you actually really want asymptotic scaling for progression purposes, right? Games that are heavily multiplicative and like progressively make the game harder and harder and harder. You actually might want these asymptotic scaling systems to enable the player to overcome certain challenges, right? Good example of a game that works like that is Heroes of Hammerwatch, or more recently Heroes of Hammerwatch 2, where the entire game basically is the enemies getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, and the player being asked to be stronger and stronger and stronger relatively every single level that they go up, every single time they new game plus, in order to be able to actually overcome those enemies. And so asymptotic scaling might be desirable up to a cap in order to help the player get to the power levels that they actually need to beat those enemies at the higher and higher and higher new game pluses, right? My perspective on this is like linear systems that use keywords can be really good if you want to use them in a lot of areas, right? Armor and magic resistance are really good examples of this, as is haste, right? Where, well, we're going to have this system in a lot of areas in the game. We're going to keyword it, and the player will understand armor means you take less physical damage. They don't need to know the exact specifics of how that works. It can be useful if they do, but they don't need to know the exact numbers around like how much damage reduction am I getting per point of armor. Well, it's 1% more effective HP per point of armor. That's how it works. That's how the formula works. Same thing, haste is 1% more spells per second per point of haste at all levels of haste. But the player doesn't have to have that deep intuitive understanding. They can just know, oh, I shred their armor by 30%. I'm going to do more physical damage to them. Cool, right? And then they can start comparing that to other other instances of that in their own systems. In the game, not in their own systems. What am I talking about? And then this was just the question slide, right? This is a presentation I gave that was originally pretty contained. It was supposed to be pretty short. I think it was supposed to originally be like 25 minutes. So I think I just did this in like 22. Obviously, there's no one here to ask questions. This isn't actually a presentation. This is just the original slide that I had here. But ultimately, hopefully this is a useful talk to understand asymptotic scaling. If you take nothing else from this talk, what I would recommend taking away from it is, number one, that these systems, any kind of percent reduction, if you can stack it in an efficient way, it's a lot more powerful than you will intuitively understand it is, right? Like, again, even something small like adding 10% damage reduction on top of 20% damage reduction is more than 10% more effective HP that you would expect, right? It is more powerful than it reads, or more powerful than it might appear. And if you take anything else away from this, there are big differences between additive and multiplicative versions of this. And before you try to optimize these types of systems, understand whether you're working in a multiplicative or an additive system, right? Or when you add 25 damage or 25% reduction plus 25% reduction, are you getting 50% or are you getting 43.75%? There are lots of different versions of these systems, but ultimately, what I have to offer here is mostly that there are ways to understand these systems. They're not intuitive, and these systems can be quite powerful when you stack them up, right? CDR, I think, is a great example of like, we changed the entire system partially to dodge this problem. But yeah, hopefully that's a fun, interesting math talk. And I'm going to cut this here because I don't think that I should keep talking about math, and I'm probably just going to keep making things worse by saying things that are less intuitive. But yeah, hopefully people enjoyed this talk. If you did, let me know. I'm totally down to do more math talks in about League or about other games, or just math in general. If people want to hear about math, hopefully this was fun. If not, tell me. You can tell me if this presentation was bad. I won't be offended. I understand the presentation is pretty dry, so apologies for that. And obviously, without my original notes, if I even had any, or without my original presentation, this probably was a little bit sort of scattered and sort of out of order. So apologies if this was not the most cohesive presentation. But otherwise, thank you for watching if you made it to this point in the video. And yeah, catch you on the next video if you decide you like this. Or if you didn't like this, the next video will probably be pretty different. So thanks for watching.